Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet more Warhammer 40k lore. Today we are going to be talking about the Necrons, a robotic race created by the godlike Catan during the war in the heavens. They were originally known as the Necrontyr, back when they were still organic life forms, and some of them still refer to themselves as such. They are frequently compared with the classical undead factions from other sci-fi and fantasy universes, and to some extent this is relatively accurate. The majority of the Necrons are little more than soulless machines who have been programmed to perform a certain task, usually involving, murdering and such things. Although calling the incredibly complex algorithms that drive the Necron warriors forwards a mere program is almost an insult, frankly. At the very least, it is far more complex than anything we could even dream of creating today, and at its most basic level, it might be described as a barely sapient machine, capable of acting and fighting based on its environment and enemy and make logical decisions based upon these factors. And considering the Necrons were once organics, it might be that it is borderline intelligence is perhaps some small echo of the creatures they used to be rather than just good old-fashioned ones and zeros. This theory is further reinforced by the existence of Necron commanders that seem to retain the cognitive capabilities of their previous selves, although often entirely stripped of certain emotions, mostly the useless ones like love, compassion, or mercy. But we'll get back to that. First, let's start out with some history. The Necrontyr race was a roughly humanoid species inhabiting an area of space known today as the Halo Stars. Now, they are said to inhabit areas of the Halo Stars. This is a bit of an old lore, new lore thing. In the new lore, the Halo Stars essentially refers to all of the stars on the outside halo of our galaxy, which obviously the Necrons wouldn't have been spread over that entire area because, well, silly. But they certainly occupied a fairly large piece of space somewhere near the edges of the galaxy. And they have been around billions of years before we ourselves crawled out of the primordial soup and began harassing each other with sticks and stones. But where we were blessed with a fairly mild and life-giving sun, the Necrontyr's home planet orbited a far angrier sort of star whose radiation ensured that Necrontyr lives were short and painful. Over the course of tens of thousands of years, however, the Necrontyr developed at least marginal resistance to the sun's radiation. Just enough to start building a society and to evolve their species. And from this point onwards, the Necrontyr advanced remarkably quickly, technologically speaking. The reasons for this was their extremely limited lifespans. That might sound a bit counterintuitive, so let me go into a bit more detail. We first need to look at their society. It was necessarily built around the idea of mortality, as an average lifespan was very short indeed, and perhaps more importantly, remarkably painful. This meant that death was not seen as something to dread, but rather as a blissful relief. A release from torturous life and the beginning of an eternity beyond the grave. Such a society naturally start venerating the dead and, in a way, worship them, and, by natural extension, death itself. And so Necrontyr cities were like massive mausoleums, in which the living were but temporary residents, and their truly permanent place was determined by their death. And said place was of course determined by their value in life. Essentially, they viewed life as a means of improving their status in the far more permanent state of death. Imagine, for example, the major religions of our time, Christianity and the like. They often portray heaven and life after death as a reward for doing good in life. The Necrontyr view of this was much like that, just far more extreme. This pushed them to always try and excel in life, to do something worthy of remembrance and therefore a grander place in the afterlife. This desperation to always do new and better things led to an explosive evolution of Necrontyr society and technology, to the point where they began looking beyond their own planet and out into the wider galaxy. This, of course, was always a logical end goal for their race as a whole, because, well, star radiation bad, so they would naturally seek to finally find some way to escape from the ravages of their sun and settle on new and more hospitable planets. Unfortunately, the galaxy is a remarkably large and relatively desolate space. There are very few planets out there in the Great Void that can outright sustain life without any form of adjustments being made, and even if a hospitable planet can be found, or technology to create one can be invented, there is still the small issue of actually getting to said planet. The Necrontyr were, for fairly obvious reasons, fairly impatient, and so began sending their population into space more or less blindly by constructing massive spacefaring crafts that travelled the Great Void at sub-light speeds. In galactic terms, this would be comparable to crossing the Pacific Ocean in a fucking rowboat. Entirely doable, and assuming the boat has been built for the task, relatively safe, but excruciatingly slow. And of course, this is just the space from one star system to another, and with the galaxy being a remarkably hostile place, you're quite unlikely to happen across a habitable planet in your first attempt, especially when you're essentially throwing ships out there blindly, as the radiation from the Necrontyr star made it virtually impossible to get accurate readings from other star systems, and any probes launched from the planet would not only be slow to reach the target and to call back home again, but even if and when the probe arrived in the next star system, there was no guarantee its communications would be able to make it back home through all of the interference from the big blazing fucker in the sky. To further complicate matters, the relative slowness of the Necrontyr ships, coupled with the short lifespans of the Necrontyr, meant that there was no way in Necrontyr hell that the crew would survive the journey. This necessitated another piece of technology, the stasis field. As the name implies, the field creates an area where the flow of time is almost completely suspended. Time is not actually frozen, but it moves so slowly that it might as well be. By placing the crew of these coffin ships inside stasis fields, the Necrontyr could extend the range of their ships to a near infinite level. All the ships would require to have on board was enough fuel for maneuvering purposes, like basic steering and acceleration-deceleration, along with circa 1 to 2 years of supplies kept in stasis fields of their own, and life support systems for the crew to help out during the initial colonization period. This is obviously still a fair mountain of food and water, but nothing compared to the amount of supplies necessary to keep the crew alive and healthy for at the very least decades and probably centuries required to reach their objectives. And while slow as balls, these colonization efforts were eventually successful, and the Necrontyr established several colonies, each colony ruled by a so-called dynasty, essentially a ruling family that had absolute control over the colony. However, these dynasties were subject to the rule of the so-called Triarch, a ruling body composed of 3 pharaohs, one of which was known as the Silent King. A pharaoh, by the way, is the rough equivalent of an imperial sector governor, and so can hold dominion over several worlds. The Silent King, on the other hand, was a singular entity, and the de facto ruler of the Necrontyr Empire. This was technically a hereditary title, but the extremely limited lifespan on even the highest members of Necrontyr society meant that the position was occupied by several different dynasties over the course of its existence. So, the Necrontyr had finally reached the stars and freed themselves from the great big shiny cunt in the sky. Or so they would have liked to believe. Unfortunately, thousands of generations spent living under that burning bastard had quite considerably influenced the Necrontyr on a genetic level. The damage was far too much to be easily repaired, as fixing their bodies would require such extreme means that in all due essence the Necrontyr would cease to be Necrontyr entirely. And in a culture founded so heavily on ancestral worship, this was a pretty bitter pill to swallow. They would have to find some way of curing their afflictions rather than removing them. And this is when they ran into the Old Ones. The mysterious creators had spread across the galaxy far quicker than the Necrontyr could ever hope to do via their webways. And while the Necrontyr Empire was still quite large, The Old Ones had secured most of the galaxy, and more importantly, due to their fetish for new life forms, they had secured the best and most fertile planets first. To make matters worse, as far as the Necrontyrs were concerned, the Old Ones were also virtually immortal, living extremely long lives stretching into the millennia, something the Necrontyr could not even dream of. As you can probably imagine, the penis envy was considerable. Additionally, the Old Ones were of the opinion that all life, no matter its state, was sacred, and should not be outright altered, and so refused to share their medical technology with the Necrontyr. Suffice to say, the Necrontyr were not overly charmed by their new acquaintances. Shitty neighbours aside, though, the Necrontyr Empire had problems of its own to deal with. Seeing as they had little to no real way of travelling quickly between the stars, the Empire became splintered and disunited. The various dynasties decided that they were better off doing whatever the fuck they wanted to do, rather than obey the instructions of their far-off overlords. As with so many other empires before it, and so many after it, the Necrontyr Empire was subject to a large-scale internal strife, varying from vocal disobedience to outright rebellions. And without a reliable way of travelling quickly between the various sectors and their colonies, there was very little the central government could do about these insurrections. Any policing force dispatched from a loyalist sector would take ages to arrive, at which point the rebels would either have moved on or dug in. And as with most rebellions, if there is no immediate and crushing response from the establishment, the rebellion quickly grows as far more dynasties realize that the Triarchs back home are essentially powerless and losing control. It didn't take long for the Silent King to realize the position his government was in. And it was a dire position indeed. Any political means to resolve any conflict had long since been exhausted, and military means were simply not practical. And so, rather than letting the unified Necrontyr Empire slip quietly into oblivion, the last of the Silent Kings, Zarek, devised a plan. He simply needed to present the Necrontyr race with something they could unify around, and more specifically, against. Something that all the various dynasties could agree on wholeheartedly, and at the same time, a goal that would, at least in their minds, let them rise above their rivals and solidify their individual prestige and position. As it so happened, this focus was simplicity itself to locate. After all, the Necrontyr had quite recently encountered the Old Ones, a race so radically different from themselves, blessed with as many gifts as the Necrontyr had curses, a race that had also denied the Necrontyr the secrets of immortality. Well, to put it bluntly, it wasn't particularly hard to convince the feuding factions to unite against so hated a foe. Especially as said foe was, well, universally hated by virtually all segments of Necrontyr society, and so fighting against them provided near limitless opportunities for self-aggrandizement and glory in the eyes of the public. Besides, the Old Ones couldn't possibly be that much of a threat. They themselves claimed to value all life and abhor its destruction. Such a race could never stand against the Necrontyr war machine that had been forged in a crucible of never-ending hardship and conquests. And on the surface, that was probably true. Unfortunately, war on a galactic scale isn't decided by a few dozen battles, and the relatively slow speed at which the Necrontyr were restricted to move at compared to the webway network of the Old Ones and their various allied races meant that the war would inevitably drag on. And in a lengthy war, the Old Ones and their servants held all the cards. They possessed the greater number of planets, the greater number of resources and production hubs, and more importantly, they possessed the time, space, and technology to create subject species like the Eldar and the Orcs to fight for them. The Necrontyr Empire was united once again, but in all due reality, the Necrontyr had no way of winning this war. In this first phase of the War in the Heavens, as it is known to the Eldar, the Necrontyr had some early successes, but over the course of a long and grueling conflict, they were eventually pushed back and isolated in the very system they had sought so desperately to escape. In the face of imminent and total defeat, the Necrontyr began to fracture once more as the various deities sought their own salvation, with many of them arguing for peace with the Old Ones. The War of Secession that was so narrowly avoided by the declaration of war against the Old Ones now come to full and terrible fruition, as the various dynasties and the ruling Triarchs waged war on one another for control of what remained of the Necrontyr Empire. Divided as they were, the Necrontyr could have been destroyed several times over by the Old Ones at this point, but the Old Ones value all life, and to them the idea of completely destroying another race was virtually inconceivable. This left the Necrontyr isolated and divided, with whatever meager hopes they once had to escape their irradiated hellhole of a home planet crushed forever. That, however, was all about to change with the appearance of an old enemy of the Old Ones, the godlike C'tans. The two races, if such a word can be used to describe the C'tans, or the Old Ones for that matter, were natural enemies. The Old Ones believed that all life, no matter how wretched or violent, was sacred, and the C'tans believed that all life, no matter how wretched or violent, was delicious. At this point in time, neither the C'tans or the Old Ones knew all that much about the other, but they knew more than enough to thoroughly despise one another. And seeing as the Old Ones had already a galaxy-spanning empire, the C'tans were somewhat on the back foot, and at that point in time, they hadn't even considered the idea of an alliance with a lesser race, or lunch, as the C'tans would refer to them. However, fate would have it that one of the C'tans, the one known as the Nightbringer, was in the right place at the right time. It was currently snacking on the Necrontyr's son. It is possible, in fact, that the Nightbringer was the cause of the Necrontyr's suffering at the hands of their son, but relatively unlikely. We don't know precisely how long it takes a C'tan to absorb all of the star's energy, and there would no doubt be massive fluctuations in said time. Anyways, but the Necrontyr were plagued by their son from the very beginning, and even with the dedication of all their people and resources, it will still have taken them tens of thousands of years to develop to the stage they were at the beginning of the war with reliable spacefaring tech and several colony worlds. It seems unlikely that the Nightbringer would have taken so long to reduce their already weakening sun to a level where life simply wouldn't be sustainable in the Necrontyr homeworld at all. But again, we simply don't know at which rate a C'tan absorbs energy, so it is entirely possible that it was the cause. On the other hand, there are several different versions of events. One claimed that the Necrontyr came in contact with the C'tan by accident in another system. The Eldar claimed the Necrontyr's hatred for the Old Ones drew the Nightbringer to them. And old Miss Saxholm down the street vehemently claims it was all the Jews' fault. Long story short, we don't really know. There are many different stories, some plausible, some idiotic. What we do know is that the current Silent King, Jarek, somehow managed to establish communication with the C'tan, a feat no one had managed before. As you can probably imagine, it's a tad bit more complicated than shouting out of a fucking window. C'tans don't think like normal creatures, big, massive star-eating monsters and all. They have a very different view on things and experience the world and thereby communications in a very different way. A Necrontyr communicating with a C'tan could be likened to a goldfish discussing philosophy with a human. The name C'tan, by the way, comes from the Necrontyr language and essentially means star god. A fitting description. So, with the basic means of communications established, the Necrontyr ran into another problem. The C'tan simply didn't perceive the world like they did, making advanced conversations essentially impossible. Therefore, the Necrontyr developed a suit, or perhaps a prison is a more apt comparison, made out of living metal called necrodermis. This suit was somehow capable of containing the full power of a C'tan, and it would let them experience the world much like how us mortals do. There was one slight complication, however. You see, the C'tans had already started taking an interest in the weak, pointless creatures they doomed to a slow death by eating their son, and had found their feelings of dread and terror intriguing. but in their current form, they couldn't really process that feeling or make any real sense out of it. In their essentially limitless existence, the dying screams of billions of people were a brief distraction at best. A minuscule moment of something different, that was all it was. But now that they possessed corporeal bodies of their own, all that changed. They had opened themselves up to a whole new world of sights and sounds, things they hadn't even had a concept of existing before their new and, ironically, limited existence. One of the C'tans, known amongst themselves as the Deceiver, had a proposition for the Necrontyr Silent King and his pharaons. And I know what you're thinking, the Deceiver, that's a rather unfortunate name for a diplomat. I bet he didn't get much done, and yeah, it is a rather unfortunate name, but fortunately for him, the Deceiver truly lived up to his reputation, to the point, in fact, that half of the time even he didn't know if he was telling the truth or not, and so hoodwinking a few Necrontyr nobles wasn't so hard. Actually, I should be referring to the Deceiver as an it, because in this particular case the SJWs are correct for once. Assigning a gender to a star god is a fairly pointless thing, so it is. The Deceiver told the Triarch Council that they had been at war with the Old Ones many millions of years ago, but were eventually defeated. It suggested an alliance. The Necrontyr would provide the C'tans with the manpower and resources, and in return, the C'tans would lend their considerable power to the Necrontyr cause. And to further sweeten the deal, they would use their essentially limitless powers to finally cure the Necrontyr race of their disabilities and grant them immortality. The Deceiver stressed that it and its like would not ask any boon for these gifts, other than the ones already mentioned in the Alliance. It was, after all, in their best interest to ensure that their valued allies were as strong as the C'tans could make them. Of course, the Necrontyr leadership were not complete idiots and found this deal far too good to be true. On the other hand, what choice did they really have? To steal a phrase from Joey Abercrombie, a man lost in the desert takes such water as he is offered. And this was quite the oasis. Everything the Necrontyr had ever wanted presented on a silver platter, with the added bonus of revenge against the hated Old Ones. It was perfect. Far too perfect, and it took the Triarchy a full year to decide, at which point they thought they had figured it all out, and there was no conceivable way their new allies could possibly screw them over. And in all due technicality, they gave them exactly what they promised. But before they armed the Necrontyr for war, the C'tans' powers were virtually unlimited. They could simply wave their hands, and engines capable of travelling from one star system to another in the blink of an eye would simply materialize. Their powers were fettered only by their imagination, and a creature that has been alive for as long as the universe itself has a fairly vivid imagination. Small surprise, then, that the majority of the Necrontyr people began to worship these creatures as gods, because, well, in old conventional sense, they were gods. Unfortunately for their new faithful, however, these gods had acquired taste for sadism. More specifically, they had begun to feed directly off the life energy of the new converts. Incidentally, the flavour of said energy is greatly enhanced by causing the subject considerable amounts of agony. It is quite unlikely that the Necrontyr ruling council was unaware of this, but probably considered it to be a relatively minor sacrifice. It wasn't like the C'tans were running rampant in the streets, and even if they were, there was precious little they could have done, so see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. And so, with the treaty agreed upon and ratified, the C'tans prepared to uphold their end of the bargain. They constructed massive furnace temples into which every single living Necrontyr was marched to cleanse themselves of their weak and frail form. Precisely what occurred inside these so-called bio-furnaces is impossible to guess, but I would imagine it involved copious amounts of screaming, hot metal, and the complete absence of a safe word. When the Silent King eventually stepped out from the furnace in his new metallic body, the price the Necrontyr had paid for their immortality was made painfully clear. The Silent King's body was indeed reinvigorated. The old aches and pains were all gone, and he could think clearly without the constant fog of pain for the first time in as long as he could remember. But in return for this peace, he had sacrificed his and all of his subjects' souls. And in the face of this realization, he felt nothing. Where once there had been Necrontyr, there were now only dead. Only Necrons. On the sunny side of undeath, however, the Necrons were now unified in a way they had not been since their original quest for the stars. Granted, that unity was the result of a command chip implanted into every Necron's brain rather than good old-fashioned agreement, but oh well, peace is peace, right? Or at least so the Silent King told himself. He held ultimate power over all Necrons via this control chip. The only Necrons that were marginally free from his direct control were a few of the old lords and the leaders of the Necron race, those with a will strong enough to hold on to some last fraction of their old selves during their transformation. Everyone else had their life spark pulled from their bodies during the process and then devoured by their new allies. Speaking of allies, the C'tans had upheld their side of the bargain and now waited for the Necrons to do their part and march out into the galaxy once more. The Silent King agreed, perhaps because he thought that fighting their age-old enemies would once again spark some sort of rage or anger in his dead machine heart, or perhaps because he simply didn't have a choice. Regardless of which, the result remained the same. With the C'tans leading the way, the Necron armies cut a swath across the galaxy, causing death and destruction on a scale never before seen. And as trillions of lives were snuffed out, the C'tans grew ever more powerful, until they could snuff out entire systems in a moment. The roles had been well and truly reversed. It was the older ones that now had no conceivable way of winning, and lost ground on every front. Be it to the reality-bending powers of the C'tans, or the endless legions of Necron warriors marching in perfect mechanical lockstep as they trampled all the old ones had built over the millennia into dust. As you can probably imagine, this military expansion led to fairly dark days for the various inhabitants of the galaxy. If they didn't get outright murdered, their planets were enslaved and forced to provide the Necrons with resources, and the C'tans with sport and food. Entire planetary populations were slaughtered in so-called red harvests to feed the Necrons' new gods, and said gods were pretty shit at agriculture. They didn't understand that if you eat the whole population on Saturday, then there won't be anyone left to eat on Sunday. In fact, they drained the galaxy of light at such a rate that they quickly began to fight between each other for the rapidly shrinking resources available. It was this infighting that saved the old ones and let them keep a hold of a foothold in the galaxy. A foothold they used to start developing countermeasures. Races specifically designed to fight the Necrons and their masters on equal terms. In the previous war, the Old Ones had won due to their superior mobility via the Webway network, but now, a C'tan known as Nyadra Zath, or the Burning One, had devised a way of breaking into the Webway, using a system of structures called the Dolmen Gates. They were nowhere near as stable or as reliable as the Old One's entrances and had a nasty habit of collapsing entirely, leaving whoever was inside at the time lost forever between dimensions. But such slight reliability concerns notwithstanding, these gates had effectively neutralized the only real card the Old Ones had left to play, and so they were forced to resort to more barbaric ways to keep themselves alive. Using their psionic and biological knowledge, they designed several new races to fight the Necrons, including the Eldar and the Orcs, along with a race that sounds eerily similar to the Tyranids. Personally, I am entertaining the possibility that the Tyranids were indeed designed by the Old Ones to combat the Necrons, though I also believe they were designed to combat the Necrons indirectly. So, here's my theory. Firstly, I believe they were created by the Old Ones based on one of the Horus Heresy books, the Pharos specifically, in which a device designed, presumably, by the Old Ones and built by the Eldar, is used as a ultra-long-range communications device and also as a beacon in the warp, much like the Astronomicon. This device was pushed to its absolute limits, and in doing so, the device created a massive flare of energy, visible from well outside the galaxy. And apparently this signal was seen by the Tyranids and described in the book as what they had been looking for. Now, this in and of itself is a decent indication, but on the other hand, maybe the spacefaring Gribblies were simply just looking for signs of life, and such a beacon would undoubtedly be a surefire indication that some form of intelligence, and therefore probably plentiful life, could be found nearby. But there is another part to my theory. You see, the Tyranids tend to avoid Necron worlds. In other words, they shy away from the worlds that the Necrons were known to have bases on. But why would they do that, I hear you ask? Surely, if they were designed by the Old Ones to fight the Necrons, they wouldn't avoid them. But here's the real beauty of it. I suspect that the Tyranids were created to act as a sort of natural fire line. Kind of like what they use to combat large-scale forest fires. You essentially empty a wide corridor of combustible material and dump tons of water on it to wet the ground in an effort to stop the fire from going in that direction. The Tyranids may have fulfilled the same basic role. They would completely empty large parts of the galaxy of the life force that the C'tans craved so much, thereby directing their attention to other places, more fertile ground, you might say, preferably further away from the Old Ones. Granted, this would seem to directly contradict the idea that the Old Ones considered all life sacred, but seeing as they were desperate enough to create the Orcs, a species famously known for their utter and complete disregard for all life, including their own, I think it's safe to say that the Old Ones were well past such idealistic concerns as #AllLivesMatter, and so if their role was indeed to create these galactic fire lines, it would make perfect sense for them to simply avoid Necron worlds, because if they did attack them, they would be providing the C'tans with the very life essence they were trying to withhold from them. Theory aside, however, what we know for sure is that while the C'tans fought each other for territory, for sport, or sometimes just for simple hubris, and occasionally to devour one another, the Old Ones plotted and grew their new races of warriors, and after several thousand years of preparation, which by the way is insanely fast, considering they were creating entirely new life forms and then teaching them how to travel the stars and fight mechanical undead and star gods, that's a pretty damn nice achievement. Eventually, they were ready to strike, and this time the young races and their old masters brought a new weapon to the table. Psychic powers. The power of the warp itself was used against the Necrons, and what with most of them being soulless machines, they had practically no defense against it. With no will of their own and no psyches of their own, the seemingly invincible Necron warriors were left completely helpless, and in the span of a mere centuries, their grip on the galaxy had begun to shatter. To combat this, the C'tans devised a way to close off the material world from the warp using complicated series of warp-dampening pylons. These structures, part Stargod magic and part technology, could completely close off access to the warp, and at the very least massively reduce its influence on the real world. These pylons, by the way, are the reason why the Cadian Gate can exist so close to the Eye of Terror, and still provide not only a stable warp route in and out, but also a loyal population to guard it. Ironically, Cadia is probably one of the most chaos-free planets in the Imperium, disregarding the occasional chaos invasion, of course. Given time, the C'tans might very well have succeeded with their plans to isolate the real world from the warp. Unfortunately for them, time was the one resource they didn't have. In their quest to defeat the C'tans, the Old Ones had tapped into powers they themselves knew were unstable and unpredictable. And one of these unpredictable consequences was about to poke its ugly bulbous head into the galactic arena. We are, of course, talking about the Enslaver Plague. Now, the Enslavers are an odd lot in 40k, since they are part of the old 40k lore, but too darn cool to simply be retconned out of existence like a certain dwarfish race. They are technically demons, as they live in the Immaterium, but also technically real living creatures with physical bodies capable of existing in our world without a constant supply of immaterial energy. This strange little contradiction is never fully explained, but it is heavily suggested that the enslavers were created, at least in part, by the Old Ones or their various subject races. This does not, however, mean that they were created physically, though. Or at least, not necessarily. As I talked about in my Chaos Explained video, demons are created and formed from the beliefs and fears of those who create them. In this case, the fear of enslavement to the Necrons and C'tans. As for their physical form, I theorize that they were indeed created, possibly by the Old Ones, but more likely by one of their subject races, to act like a portal for focusing warp energies. The Old Ones had already created several races capable of manipulating the warp, so creating a race capable of directly tapping into the warp would seem to be the logical next step. At least, it would be to a less informed servant race of the Old Ones. Problem was that since these creatures were linked directly to the warp, they would inevitably be shaped by the warp. And during this time in the galaxy, the warp must have been overflowing with feelings of fear and suffering. I hypothesize, therefore, that the enslavers were affected by and shaped by these emotions, just like a natural inhabitant of the warp would. And so, as we discussed in the Chaos video, they would naturally seek to increase their power by feeding the emotions that empower them, in this case, fear, and more specifically, the fear of enslavement. Alternatively, they could just be a massive cosmic coincidence. Regardless of the real reason behind the enslavers, the fact remains that they spread incredibly quickly across the galaxy, due to their particular brand of psychic powers, which lets them mind control other creatures, and tap into the latent connection to the warp that was so common among the Old Ones' newer creations, and turn these creatures into living warp portals, through which more enslavers could be summoned. And, as already mentioned, psychic races were extremely common in the galaxy at that time, so the enslaver plague could spread like, well, a plague. And the timing could not be better, or worse, depending on your point of view. The Old Ones and their subjects were exhausted, and the C'tans probably even more so. Especially as the C'tans had been spending their time quite literally eating each other for the last few thousand years. On the other hand, for the Necrons, the enslavers were actually extremely convenient. The Old Ones were finally defeated and scattered, their various servant races being wasted to fuel the enslavers, and the enslavers in turn eating Necron worlds and populations. But that's a story of another time. Whether the Old Ones were completely destroyed or simply fled the galaxy is unknown, but whichever one it is, they no longer had any real power over this galaxy. And when it comes to the C'tans, well, they were greatly reduced in numbers as well, as they had been killing each other off for quite a while now. Additionally, the C'tans had absolutely no reason to suspect their mindless machine puppets would ever rise against them. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that you've been taken prisoner by Lego figurines, and you'll have a rough approximation of the level of what the fuck the C'tans experienced when the Necrons blasted them into star particles with big-ass space guns. In fact, the rebellion itself went pretty well, considering it was directed against a race of creatures so powerful they might as well be gods, but it certainly didn't come cheap. Millions of Necrons had been destroyed for good in the conflict, and despite their best efforts, the C'tans were not dead, per se. In fact, killing a C'tan is practically impossible. In fact, it is a practical impossibility. You just can't kill energy, and the C'tans are essentially energy. It just cannot be done with mortal means, and so the Silent King went for the next best thing, and imprisoned the C'tan shards inside complex dimensional prisons known as Tesseract Labyrinths, and then dumped said prisons into stasis fields to ensure that their occupants remained safely locked away. As to the reason why the Necrons rebelled, well, simply put, they weren't all too enthused by their new management, who had developed a habit of throwing away countless Necrons, well, lives, quote-unquote, for sport. And of course, there's still that whole thing with the C'tans essentially enslaving the entire Necrontyr race and devouring their souls in the process. That kind of antisocial behaviour tends to earn you some enemies. And so, with their Star God masters overthrown, the Silent King and the 6 or 7 Necrons left alive with a working brain danced happily into the sunset. Except for one small detail. The old ones might be gone, but those pesky Eldar were still around, and they had constructed quite the little empire for themselves. And having learned quite a few tricks from their former masters about the warp and how to control it, they managed to not get completely fucked over by the enslavers. And with said enslavers being so darn effective, they quickly ran out of food and presumably returned to the warp, seeing as there's no concrete mention of them getting destroyed, leaving the Necrons alone and hilariously outnumbered by the very race that had been kicking their shiny metallic asses all over the galaxy for centuries. The Necrons were fast running out of options, but luckily, they had one rather unique card left to play. The Silent King and what remained of his council decided to stick their proverbial heads in the sand and enter into stasis, assuming, quite correctly, that the Eldar Empire would eventually crumble as all life inevitably does. I bet you he didn't expect his pointy-eared arch-enemies to fuck themselves into oblivion, but hey, whatever works, right? Of course, it was still going to take quite a while for the Eldar to lose their grip on the galaxy, and even the Necrons could fall prey to good old-fashioned boredom, and so the Necron race would have to be entombed into massive stasis complexes, where they could wait out the Eldar race. Naturally, it took quite a bit of work to essentially convert entire planets into massive stasis tomb complexes with enough room for the entirety of the Necron race, but extinction is a pretty good motivator, and the complexes were eventually finished. The Silent King ordered his people to sleep for roughly 60 million years, give or take a few millennia, and after having given the final order to enter the stasis tombs, he voluntarily burned out the command protocol from his mind, as he felt he no longer had the right to command those whom he had failed to protect. Interestingly, though, the Silent King himself did not enter stasis, and instead decided to wander the galaxy for some sort of meaning to his existence, eventually deciding that he would find some way to return the Necrons to their original form. Well, minus the radiation sickness, obviously. As for the rest of the Necrons, their primary concern was to re-establish their dominance over the galaxy once they awaken, which they did in what we now know as the 41st millennium. The timing wasn't quite right, as the galaxy was still heavily populated by Psyches and Chaos and pointy-eared space elf, but it could have been worse. I mean, they could have waken up right in front of a fucking Astartes legion, which probably would have been bad news. Nevertheless, there was plenty of work to do. The Eldar had to be destroyed, obviously, because you just can't trust those bastards and their elf magic. Chaos had to be dealt with also, and that involves finishing the C'tan's plans to isolate the galaxy from the warp. And without their glorious C'tan masters, they would have to do this the good old manual way. Thirdly, the various new races had to be subjugated, and that was not a simple task considering the sheer number of monkeys that had popped up over the course of the years, but the Necrons have plenty of time, and with their original will and agency more or less kinda restored, it's a pretty dang probable bet that the various Necron dynasties would also have some old grudges to settle with their shiny comrades. There is, however, once again a slight complication. Even with Necron technology, the act of sending an entire race into a dormant state for 60 million years is an exceptionally risky thing to do. Millions, and quite possibly billions of Necrons were lost to malfunctions, Eldar retributions, or simply just natural causes, e.g. planets undergoing massive changes, like large-scale tectonic movements destroying tombs, or, particularly large space rocks smashing into the planet, etc., etc. To further complicate matters, the Necrons were apparently quite shit at constructing alarm clocks, and along with a million other reasons that slowly accumulated over the course of 60 million years, the Necrons did not reawaken as one people, but rather they were awakened almost completely at random. A potentially fatal flaw that has forced many Necron dynasties to flee their worlds after discovering that they are now awake on a planet filled to the brink with orcs or other uncomfortable life forms, and no friendlies anywhere nearby to come help clean house. On those occasions that the Necrons do awaken with a degree of success, however, it still takes a very long time for them to become fully operational. The process of reviving can be quite complex and time-consuming, especially for the Necron nobility. As mentioned previously, very few Necrontyr were able to hold on to their original personalities when they were transformed. Additionally, there were different levels of this transformation. The more important Necrontyr were given better bodies and therefore better chances of retaining their individuality, while the peasant scum almost always became little more than machines. This means that unless the ruling class can be awakened, the rest of the Necrons will simply continue to guard their tombs without ever trying to expand or do much of anything really. On those occasions where the shiny clankers of substance are awoken, they often find that they will have to wait around while their subjects are also roused before doing much of anything either. But when everyone is finally moving about, the various dynasties can start to go about their business, often in wildly varying ways. Some dynasties will engage in diplomacy in an effort to regain their previous territory. Some will focus on rebuilding their worlds and pretty much ignore everything else, and some will simply leave to go pursue some other agenda. Usually, though, they tend to be a bit more aggressive, though again there's a great deal of variety in their methods. Some, for example, will fight while strictly following their own rules of conduct and code of honor. For example, some dynasties consider themselves honor-bound to let their adversaries retreat peacefully if they wish, and will even give them a reasonable time limit to do so, while other dynasties sees this as a quite pointless thing and will use any and all means to regain their former territory. As to how successful the Necrons will be in this new galaxy is yet to be seen, but they should most certainly not be underestimated. And that is all for this video on the Necrons. I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.